Segment 4, which included pages 50 to 58 of our behavioral neuroscience textbook, talked about various topics, including the vascular system of the brain, different brain imaging techniques that help researchers reveal the different structures and their functions of the brain, and the types of methods of these brain imaging techniques. And the chapter also briefly touched on the field of social neuroscience and that developing field and emerging field. So the first topic that it talked about was the vascular system of the brain, which included major arteries. It talked about the carotid arteries, which are large blood vessels that ascend the left and right sides of the neck to the brain, and these arteries supply blood to the anterior and middle arteries, which in turn supply blood to about 2/3 of the cerebral hemispheres. The blood supply for the rest of the cortex is supplied by the posterior cerebral arteries, which arise from the basilar artery, which is a structure where the left and right vertebral arteries form. The basilar artery also supplies blood to the posterior and the brainstem. Other major structures of the vascular system that the text explains includes the circle of Willis, which is a joining part of arterial paths, which serves as an alternate route for blood flow if an artery happens to be damaged or blocked, such as someone having a stroke, which is a clot, narrowing, or rupture that interrupts blood flow to a specific part of the body, and that part of the body consequently stops functioning. The other major structure is the blood-brain barrier, which is a wall of brain capillaries that are resistant to the passage of large molecules from blood vessels into the brain cells. And this barrier makes it more difficult for substances in the blood to enter the brain than it is in other organs of the body. However, in addition to protecting the brain from potentially harmful substances, it also makes it a little bit harder to treat the brain using drugs. The text then moves on to talk about various brain imaging techniques that scientists use to help reveal structures and functions of the different parts of the brain. So there are two major groupings of techniques, and the first grouping measures density and uses those measurements to map structures of the brain. So the first technique is called an angiography, which involves cerebral blood vessels being filled with radiopaque dye via catheter, and an X-ray pic of the head is then taken. And this technique helps diagnose vascular diseases. The second technique is computerized axial tomography, or a CAT scan, which is an X-ray absorption being measured at different spots of the brain, and then the image of the brain is created based in the tissue density being measured. A third technique is a magnetic resonance imaging scan, or MRI scan, and this scan uses magnetic energy to generate images that reveal some structural details in the brain. This scan allows for a higher resolution than CAT scans and does not expose patients to potentially harmful X-rays. And then the fourth scan is a diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI scan. It uses MRI tech used to study specifically white matter made up of tracks or axon bundles, and it is based on the property of fractional anisotropy, which is the tendency of water to diffuse more readily along axons, which reflect connections between brain regions. this tendency also forms the basis of DTI tractography, or fiber tracking, which produces structural images of axonal fiber pathways. The second grouping of techniques includes mapping brain activity during behavior. So the first technique the text mentions is positron emission tomography, or PET scans, which obtains images of brain activity by injecting radioactive substances used by the brain into the bloodstream. The second technique is functional MRI scans, or fMRI scans, which are exactly like MRI but a little bit better. They detect small changes in metabolism, for example, the use of oxygen, and identifies regions of the brain that are active during a given task. The third technique is called optical imaging, which is a method for visualizing brain activity in which near-infrared light is passed through the skull and partly into the cortex, and detectors pick up the reflections through the scalp, and the responses reveal the different activities and activity levels of different cortical regions. The fourth technique is called the transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, in which cortical neurons in the cortex are non-invasively stimulated by magnetic fields, and stimulated regions and behavioral effects are tracked. Or an offshoot of this method is repetitive TMS, which is when the magnetic stimulation is cycled several times per second instead of briefly. The fifth technique is called magnetoencephalography, or MEG, which measures tiny magnetic fields produced by active neurons in order to identify regions of the brain that are particularly active during a given task. This collection of different methods can help reveal and study lesions, which are regions of damage to the brain. Studies have also revealed that patients in a coma show parts of the brain are still active thanks to these different methods. Some methods can provide high spatial resolution, which would be very fine structural detail, but may have low temporal resolution, which means that the tracking of dynamic changes in the brain activity is very slow, or other methods might have vice versa. And the last section of this segment talks about the emerging field of social neuroscience, which is the field that aims to understand brain activity as it relates to interactions with others, and it uses the different neuroscience techniques that are discussed in the chapter to better understand the neural bases of social processes. One example of a method that is used in this field is called the dyadic functional MRI, which is an MRI scanner, but with 2 head coils instead of 1. And these 2 head coils are used to scan the brains of 2 separate people who are directly interacting with each other side by side in the machine. So the emerging field and technology of social neuroscience promises to unlock more secrets of the brain.